My name is Idie Kesner, and I'm the Dean of the Kelley School of Business. It's my absolute privilege to introduce Carter Cast. Carter earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Stanford University and an MBA from Northwestern. Currently, he's a clinical professor of innovation and entrepreneurship on the faculty of the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. He's also a venture partner at Pritzker Group Venture Capital, where he assesses potential investments and advises portfolio companies. Carter is a board member of the Kellogg Company, SMS Assist, and Family Action Network. And perhaps most importantly for our interview today, Carter is the author of the recently published book, The Right and Wrong Stuff: How Brilliant Careers Are Made and Unmade. During his career, Carter has played a pivotal role in building multiple iconic brands while working at some of the best-known organizations: Pepsico, Electronic Arts, Blue Nile, and Walmart, among others. In his book, he reinforces some of the lessons learned throughout his career. Welcome, Carter. It's a privilege to have you here.
Thank you.
Before I have you talk about your personal journey, I want to get started down the path of understanding the concept of derailment, which is what your book is about. Can you first review for us what derailment is and what are the most common causes?
Sure. So derailment is, in the way I wrote this book, I focused on people that had talent. Why do good people fail? What about you could hurt you? That's the topic of this book. So we're looking at talented people who were expected to reach a certain level of achievement. Maybe they were deemed to be VP level by the HR department or their boss, and they fell short. They got demoted, they got fired, or their career flatlined. So these are people that wanted to grab the brass ring and something happened and they didn't get there. I wanted to understand why that happens and what we can do about it to fix it.
That makes sense. There's a wonderful story in the book, and I wonder if you might share it with the audience. It's a personal story to you, and it's probably what took you on this journey of researching and writing about derailment. So I'm hopeful that you might be able to describe the story at PepsiCo that really got you started.
Yes, I was a senior marketing manager, and I was working in new product development at Frito Lay. I was only a couple years, I was probably 33, a few years out of my MBA. And up until then, I'd had pretty good performance reviews. So I was called into my boss's office for my annual performance review in December. And he said, Carter, go straight to the final page, which is sort of the money page at PepsiCo. That's the page where you see what your development potential is. So it might say L18 plus if you were deemed to be senior vice president or higher. I looked in that upper right-hand corner and it said hold in place. And I turned back to the first page and he said, you're no longer considered a promotable person at PepsiCo. And furthermore, I want you off my team. You're insubordinate, you're difficult, you're recalcitrant. I had to look that up, I wasn't quite sure. And I want you off my team. And I said, Mike, I'll call him Mike, because his name was Mike. Mm-hmm. I said, Mike, am I getting fired? And he said, not technically, but good luck finding somebody that wants to work with you. So I took some time over the holiday, took 2 weeks off, and I decided I wanted to go back because I didn't want to leave with that sort of blight on my resume. So I came back, and sure enough, I found as I was sort of peddling my shoddy wares up and down the halls that some of the senior managers thought I was difficult and didn't want me in their group. I was completely blindsided by this. I didn't know that I had this sort of issue in managing up. So I finally found a fellow that would take me in who was from Canada. He didn't know my reputation because he just moved from Toronto. So he worked with me on this issue I had. But the point of the story is that what you don't know about yourself can hurt you. And I had this interpersonal issue. I had call it almost an oppositional defiance disorder with senior management if they were heavy-handed. So this boss I had was a new boss. I hadn't had him for very long. And as he reached down and wanted to check my work and wanted more updates on the business, I handled him poorly. I didn't update him. I went my own way. I sort of, brushed him aside because I'd been in the position for 3 years, and I thought, I know what I'm doing. You should just leave me alone and let me do my thing. He had other things in mind. So I learned this painfully. When I look back on this stretch of my career, Idie, I was a manager for 10 years. I was from assistant to manager in a 10-year stretch. I didn't get promoted to director or VP. And two of my closest friends, one was president and CEO of Ticketmaster, and the other one was a private equity firm doing very well, and I was a manager. And so something wasn't working well with the way I was approaching things, and what it was is I had an inability to manage up effectively, and I didn't really realize how bad it was until this guy blasted me with a 2x4 upside my head in my performance review. So I think that was one of the major reasons I wanted to write the book. The other reason was I see students all day long at Northwestern, and they're generally 25 to 40 years old, probably in their 30s often, and they'll say, Carter, I'm thinking of going to McKinsey, but I'm also thinking of taking this Series A startup in Silicon Valley. Help me think through, the pros and cons of these. And so, it's a lot. So you kind of pull back. What are you passionate about? When you're absorbed in tasks, what are you doing? Where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years? The typical questions you ask. And then I always ask this question: what about you could hurt you? And I never get good responses. What? What do you mean? What about me? What about you could impede you from reaching the goals that you have? And the lack of self-awareness I would receive in these responses, these blank looks I get, I thought, I derailed, and I'm hearing, these poor answers to this very straightforward question. I think people lack visibility or understanding of what can hurt them, because we live in this day and age of everybody gets a trophy, and we all like to give good feedback. Everyone loves strength finders. What's not to like about a movement that tells you to focus on your strengths? But in my experience, it's there's nothing that'll stop your career like sweep you at the knees like a good derailer. So I think that was my motive for doing it.
Right, that makes sense. I'm struck by the example that you gave. When you got this feedback, you actually took a 2-week break and decided to think about it and to think about how you were going to respond. I can imagine receiving that kind of feedback, that very direct feedback. Some people might give up and say, I'm going to go elsewhere. Some people might say, you have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not going to listen to you. You don't really know who I am and what my strengths are. How did you talk yourself into saying, this could be my problem and I've got to do something about it? How do you get over such very direct and harsh feedback?
Well, I did go through the stages of grief. I mean, I went through denial and how dare he and who does he think he is? Doesn't he know who I am? I went through all of that anger, and disbelief. And then I realized that, it doesn't matter if the rock hits the vase or the vase hits the rock. It's bad for the vase. Whether he was wrong or I was right, it didn't matter. I was put on ice, and I was kicked off of a good brand and put on a secondary brand. So if I wasn't willing to accept this feedback, it was going to hurt me. So I started asking people that I could trust, that were sort of truth sayers, if I had this sort of oppositional defiance and if I managed up poorly. And they said, yeah, you have your moments with authority figures. So I asked people I could trust, and I heard the feedback from other people. And then, of course, when I tried to put myself on somebody else's team and people weren't that interested, I realized I had a reputation. It had done some reputational damage that I had to work on fixing. Which brings me to actually one of the statistics in the research that was really interesting, Idie. 80% of the people that recovered because they owned their derailment. They owned what happened to them. They took the onus. They were the agent of their own change. They were the agent of change. They didn't project the issue on their boss or the culture of the company, or I was an impossible assignment. They took accountability for what happened, because if you take accountability for it, you can address it. So I then painstakingly went through what situations trigger me to behave poorly with senior management. And it was like ponderous bureaucratic meetings. When I'm challenged on something I felt I had done my research on and I knew well, I would get sort of overly righteous about it. So I've identified 4 or 5 settings that were triggers. And then I said, when I go into these certain situations, I'm going to really aggressively self-monitor and practice control, self-control. And so that was the beginning of my recovery. But it took a couple years before I was back on the sort of trajectory I wanted to in my career as a result of this.
I think that's really great advice, because what you're basically saying is you have to do some self-reflection and figure out your own individual trigger points. What are the triggers that are causing you to do something that ultimately will derail your career, that are a negative? And try and deal with those specific triggers. Try and find coping mechanisms that allow you to get over those things.
And you know, it's not an indictment. Everybody has these. Everybody has these interpersonal vulnerabilities. You know, Robert Hogan, the researcher. He has the Hogan Psychological Inventory, and is specifically called the Hogan Development Survey. That looks at 11 derailers that are interpersonal in nature, that come out under stress. And in his research, 98% of people have at least one of them. I took the test 2 times while I was doing the research, and I had 2 of them consistently. We use the Hogan to evaluate people and to understand where they need help, where they need work. So the Hogan, it'll study things like overly excitable, melodramatic, skeptical, overly perfectionistic, leisurely, all of these, and there's 11 of them. And so I'm a big fan of this instrument, and I think it's one of the most rigorous self-assessments. So for people out there, if you're really interested in understanding where you might have a dark side tendency, I would recommend you look at the Hogan as a tool. You do need a coach to take you through the Hogan, because it's a very robust assessment. There's a lot of subscales you won't understand unless you have somebody that's certified as a Hogan coach. But if you're suffering in this interpersonal area, first of all, don't beat yourself up too much. We all have these areas. But if you understand it, you can work around it.
That's great advice. Carter, at Kelley, we speak a lot about moments, and we talk about turning moments into momentum. And I think it's really critical for a person's success to be able to take moments in their career and get lift or momentum out of them. I'm curious if there are particular moments or pivot points, if you will, when there's a tendency to derail. And in other words, let's take extenuating circumstances out of it. Obviously, if you're ill or if you have a family member who's ill, those could be derailers in a career because there are these things happening outside. But I'm wondering if there are times when the risk of derailment might be higher than at other times.
That's a great question, and the answer is there is definitely a time that the risk of derailment goes up, and it's almost counterintuitive. Lots of times it's once you get promoted. More broadly, it's in times of transition, when you're going through change, because what generally happens is, let's say you get promoted, and you go from being an individual contributor to a manager, or you go from a manager to running a function, or you go from running a function to running a SBU. Either way, every one of these moves, these transitions, is literally a transformation of identity. What got you here will not get you there. And what happens is our bosses, because they've promoted us, they think we're talented, and they think, oh, well, Carter or Idie will figure it out. They're good. That's when we need our bosses' help the most. That's when we need help to understand what is the standard and what are the activities and what are the competencies I need to develop as a manager that I didn't didn't need, that weren't critical as an individual contributor. So what I say to people is, and by the way, there's a good book called The Leadership Pipeline that examines these transformations you need to go through in key transition points of your career. But when you go from individual contributor to a manager, you got to go from me to we, and learning to coach, learning to communicate well, much better than as an individual contributor. So the best thing I think you can do is go to people who've been there before and ask them, when you made this transition, what were some of the challenges that I should watch out for? And then make sure you sit down with your boss and say, what does success look like in this new role? What should my goals and objectives be, and what are the key performance indicators? And if they say, well, I don't know, figure it out, go back and draft your goals and objectives and KPIs and come back to your boss and say, does this look, if I do this, will this be what a successful tenure in this position looks like? Because you want their enlistment and their agreement on the terms.
That makes sense. That makes sense. One of the reasons I like your book so much is because you've got a lot of personal experiences in this book. And I'm going to ask you a difficult question about one of them. In the book, you describe a situation when you're waiting for a meeting to start, and a senior executive arrives, approaches you, and notes that you're sitting in his chair or the chair he wants.
Yeah.
And normally, you said this would have really bothered you, and you would have probably said something snide and something, that would have been part of this derailment phenomena that was going on prior to the feedback that you received. But having gone through this sort of experience and the feedback, you simply said, excuse me, and you got up and you moved. And I wonder if your advice might be different for young women executives who might be fighting bias or dismissal related to gender stereotypes. In her book, Sheryl Sandberg, the book Lean In, she suggests that women shouldn't be apologetic, shouldn't be submissive in ways that might harm their self-confidence or harm others' perceptions of them. So would your advice differ for women than for men in that circumstance?
It's tough for me because I'm a privileged, a male who has not had to fight through some of these things. So what I'm saying is based more on observation. It's certainly not based on personal experience. When I've had bosses that are very successful women and I've observed their behavior and learned from them, I see this combination of humility but assertiveness. So they can be bold when they need to be, and they can be humble when they need to be. Situational leadership. They come in strong when they feel strongly about something, and they come in with facts and data, and they're assertive. They aren't halfway in. They don't say, well, I kind of object, but if they object, and they have data behind it. Because a lot of men will just start talking. I object, I don't know about that. But the standard for women, it's not fair, but it can be a standard is higher if you're going to come in and disagree with your male counterpart in the meeting. And if you're a young woman manager, you better have your argument lined up. And if you go in, go all the way in, meaning pick your shots. If you're going to disagree with information behind you and data and insights behind you that you can lean on. So this is this sort of combination of humility and I think assertiveness that you decide, this isn't a battle I'm going to fight right now, and you stay and you like. I would not fight that battle of when Dr. Hurd told me to get out of my seat. I don't think that's a battle you need to fight as a senior manager with an executive vice president. So he can have his seat, right? But if it's something important that'll affect your business or will affect you, like your salary, or disagreeing on how you performed in an area and you have new data or better data than your boss, it's the time to be assertive, but come in with information.
That makes a lot of sense. And I like your advice about being a situational leader, reading the situation really well. And I think that's important for everyone, but what I'm hearing you say is especially important for women to be able to read those situations well and know when to pick your battles.
Yeah,
so.
I saw one of our division presidents at Pepsico one time. And this was at Taco Bell International, and we'd had a terrible year. We were really having trouble getting the concept off the ground in Canada, where I was living. And he was relentless. He challenged all of our numbers. His voice was loud. He said, I am not funding this until you fix this. I want you to fly back to New York and show me a plan that works. And I was just watching him thinking, oh my goodness. 2 hours later, Pizza Hut, which was part of PepsiCo at the time, Pizza Hut gave their performance. He was very quiet. At times he would whisper to his CFO, and then he'd ask a few clarifying questions, and then when it was over, he said, it was the time of the Olympics, and he said, this was a gold medal performance. I would love to take all of you out for a drink. And I just watched the situational leadership where he came strong when he had to, and then he was quiet and supportive when he had to. He knew when he had to lean in, and he knew when he didn't.
Great advice. Great advice. Carter, there's so much good information in this book, and one piece of information in particular, one statistic, which is based on your research, really struck me, and I read it several times when I got to that part of the book. And the idea is individuals who have an inflated sense of their skill level and understate their interpersonal issues are more than 6 times likelier to derail than those with an accurate understanding of their skills and interpersonal issues. What do you recommend people do to avoid that critical pitfall? That statistic struck me as very important.
It was the statistic that probably got me to write the book. When I was doing the research and I saw that statistic and I thought, oh my goodness. There's an article in HBR a few weeks ago by a woman named Urich, E-U-R-I-C-H, and she said, and this was a meta study of self-awareness, she said there's internal self-awareness. Do you understand your own motives, drivers, strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and external self-awareness. Do you understand how you're coming across to others? And she said only 10 to 15% of people in her study had both. You might have good internal self-awareness, but you don't really understand how you're coming off to others. Or you may be really good with others, but you don't understand what really drives you. And so when you think about that staggering statistic, it's no wonder that so many people run into trouble. Because if you don't know what you're good at or where you have vulnerabilities, how do you improve? So that statistic of 6 times more likely to derail, that came from me looking at 360s. So if you look at a 360 and you gave yourself, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, a 4 in analytical thinking, and your boss and your peers and your subordinate averaged give you a 2, how are you going to improve your analytical thinking if you think you're a 4 and they think you're a 2? You're not aware of the issue, so you can't remedy it. So the key to this is getting good feedback, being real with yourself on what you stink at, what you're good at, and maybe just what you have a gap at that you need to fill, and find solutions to these things or find workarounds to issues. Because what sinks careers is a lack of self-awareness about an area of vulnerability, just like it hurt me, when I was at Frito Lay.
That makes sense, and being open to that self-awareness, those points that you're observing.
Yeah, being courageous enough to look inside yourself and say, I have to change this to be more effective. Carol Dweck, her book Mindset, she talks about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, and I love this book. And I've had dinner with her 3 times. I've stalked her. Carol, would you please, can I take you out and can you talk about your research? She's a Stanford psychologist. She said a fixed mindset person feels scared to try new things because they feel like if they fail, it defines them as a person. A growth mindset person is always in a state of beta. They're always testing and trying things and experimenting. And if something fails, it's just one thing they've learned that they didn't know before. So they don't see failure as a failure, they see failure as another experiment they tried that they learned from. And that sort of approach of having this growth mindset is how you're going to make sure these derailers don't bite you.
Yeah, I like that beta test sort of approach.
Living a state of beta.
I like that. Here's another surprising statistic that came out of your book. You cited that of the 67 job competencies in the Lominger Limited model, developing others was dead last in terms of the skills managers have, and motivating others was only 59 out of 67.
Yeah.
In light of that, I'm wondering, is the onus on the individual to think about these skills where you're not really doing well, where you don't really demonstrate what you need to, especially to go to the next level? Or is that something the organization should take care of for us and provide those opportunities?
Yeah.
Where's the onus for fixing those problems?
Well, you hit another one of the key statistics of the book. The Lominger, which does competency tracking, and by the way, there's a third one, willing to have difficult conversations. That was in the 63rd or something. So all of these were around developing others, and managers are poor at them. basically, if you're waiting for your manager to get good at these things, statistics, the data would show you could wait a long time. So the onus has to be on us. We have to be, it's a DIY world. The chance that we're going to find a boss that cares about our development is low. And I think part of it is we live in this age now of this transactional relationship between employer and employee, the 1099, the gig economy, the 1099 generation, this transactional relationship. So the age where they're going to develop you and it's going to be this reciprocity, we'll develop you and you're going to give us 15 years of your talent. You don't see that anymore. So employers aren't holding bosses accountable for developing the subordinate. So the subordinate, we have to develop ourselves. We have to raise our hand for new job assignments. We have to ask to be put on a task force that will be enriching. We have to go to the conference that'll help us learn. We have to dig into a new technology like AI as it relates to customer service and voice recognition and write our own white paper on it to develop our skills in new areas. And we have to go out and tour with suppliers. We have to go out and tour with customers. We have to do these things because it's not happening for us anymore. And that is, I think, the ultimate message of the book, besides self-awareness is critical, is you have to take care of your own career because no one's going to do it for you.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I know the book is relatively new, and so many of those viewers that are out there may not have had a chance to read it yet. You have some archetypes in the book, and I'm wondering if you might give us a heads up on some of these types that you've witnessed and that your research has revealed.
Sure. I talked to over 100 people that had derailed, had gotten fired or demoted, and then I talked to a lot of talent coaches, executive coaches, HR VPs, and found 5 themes over and over. And I created these characterizations around these 5 themes to make it more palatable, not so scary. So the first one is interpersonal issues, and I call this guy Captain Fantastic. And this is someone who has dismal listening skills and is so me-centric that he's not going to be successful in enlisting others, especially as he rises and business is more complex and he needs to rely on others. He is not going to have their support because he's all about himself. So he derails because of his egocentric, and he doesn't learn from experiences either. So that is a big one. The second one happens early in the career more often, and I call this person the Soloflyer. This is somebody who has trouble building and managing teams, developing teams. So this affliction, it can either be you overmanage, you micromanage, you don't develop your teammates, you don't teach them to fish, you try to fish for them, or you don't understand how to manage context. Now, what do I mean by that? It's one thing for me to manage you, and it's another thing for me to manage this team, but half my job has to be getting resources and aligning cross-functionally with groups that we have dependencies on so that I will get the resources for the team to do their jobs well. So you have to be this sort of ambassador, and you have to build bridges cross-functionally, and the Soloflyer doesn't understand that. So that's the Soloflyer. That often hurts us early in a career, but you can remedy that one. The third one is really frightening, and it's the second biggest derailer in terms of the incidence rate, and that is version 1.0. That is someone who's not adaptable to change. They're never going to be version 2.0. They're version 1.0. They get in a groove, they get complacent, and the groove becomes a rut. We've got to flush them out of the office. You've got to increase your learning curve, increase your learning agility. This is where you go out and talk to customers, improve your observational skills, do some ethnographic research, experiment, build prototypes and test things. Question, ask what if and how might we. I was in 3 meetings with Steve Jobs when I was CEO of Walmart.com. And everyone had told me, oh, he's really tough to work with, and he's a prima donna. That man asked more good questions in our meeting than anybody in the room. Clayton Christensen of Harvard said, people that are innovatively minded have a ratio of 6 to 1 on questions asked to statements made. I thought that was kind of cool. So for version 1.0, are you experimenting? Are you questioning? Are you observing? Are you observing your customer in the purchase cycle? Are you networking with smart people to understand new industries and applications better? You gotta flush this guy out of his office, or her out of her office. The fourth one is the one-trick pony. That's someone who's gone up in a really narrow way and they haven't broadened, so they don't understand how all the pieces fit together in their company, and they're considered to be non-promotable because they don't have a broad strategic vantage point on the business. This is a tricky one, isn't it? You've got to get to be an expert, right? You've got to take the time to get good at something. That's your career capital. But at some point, you have to start broadening your skill set and increase your experiential knowledge by taking lateral moves. So maybe if you're in marketing, you should go, take a job in sales or trade marketing. Or maybe if you're in merchandising, you should go into manufacturing to broaden yourself and understand how the product is made. So that is the one-trick pony, and it's the number one derailer of women. And I think it's an access problem. It's not having access to opportunities that will broaden you. So if I got a hold of a one-trick pony and they reported to me, I would lay out the value chain of our company and say, what are the critical activities we do to create differentiation in the value chain? So if you're at Walmart, critical activities, sourcing, right, lowest price, assortment planning, good, better, best, trend, core trend, and trend, and core trend and trend. Logistics, inbound and outbound logistics for the warehouse, and store operations, understanding how to merchandise the store in a planogram. I just listed 5 things. I would give the one-trick pony a day with an expert in each one of those areas in the course of maybe 2 months, and she would not be a one-trick pony after that, because she would understand the key components of the value chain in our company, and that would make her more strategic. So I think that one's very solvable. And then the last one is the whirling dervish, which is someone that is overcommitted and balls drop. Probably not well organized, probably has trouble prioritizing, has difficulty saying no to things, and their word isn't their bond. They don't deliver on promises, and people distance themselves from this person. They're really well intended. They're often very creatively minded people, but they're overextended and they aren't focused.
You've given me some great ideas that these derailers can perhaps impact men and women differently and impact different stages of your career differently.
Oh, yes.
So in other words, some may be problems early on in your career and some later in your career. I'm gonna flip the table just for 1 second. So imagine that we've got viewers who are thinking, well, I'm seeing someone in my organization who's derailing, and it's my job to try and give that person feedback. It's my job to communicate with that person what I'm seeing. I think you were lucky in some respects. Mike gave you good feedback. You had a gift given to you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do you have advice for how managers can be effective in helping people that they are seeing on their team who are going up in flames, who are derailing?
Great question. The problem was that we often give feedback one time a year during the performance review, and then you pile it on, and what good is it when you're looking in the rearview mirror and talking about sins 6 months ago? I think the key is a steady stream of feedback. So one little model that I would offer up is, so let's say Idie reports to me, which of course is ridiculous, but just for the sake of argument. You report to me and you've just given a presentation. I'm your boss. We walk out of the room. As we're walking out of the room, I'll say, while it's fresh, I'll say, Idie, tell me one thing you think you did well. And I listen. And when you're done talking, I say, here's one thing I think you did well. That builds confidence. Then I'll say, Idie, what's one thing you would do differently? When you're done talking, I say, here's one thing I think you could have done differently. That builds skill. Builds confidence, builds skill, and we're done. Takes 5 minutes. Think if we did that for our subordinates, every single time there was a key moment that they went through, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, they wouldn't be blindsided at the end of the year. They'd have a steady stream of feedback, and they would know that you're in their corner wanting to see them improve because the feedback is balanced. There's something developmental and then there's something really positive that you want to amplify. So that's one thing I think that I would stress is make sure that you're seeking feedback on a constant basis, because once you ask for feedback, your boss or whomever you're asking it realizes that you're genuinely interested in learning and developing, and they'll be more likely to be forthcoming and give you more feedback.
Right. So when you're doing these feedback sessions, when you're reviewing a person's performance, should you be focused on the past and giving examples of things they've done poorly in the past? Should you be focused on the future, where you need them to head in the future? How do you balance those two things?
I think it's really, I think so many performance reviews are just a terrible waste of time. The reason we're doing it is so we can, put a % increase next to their name and do it for, for budget planning. If you do this correctly, I believe it should be done at least quarterly, not annually. And when you do it, spend maybe 20 minutes on rear view mirror, start, stop, continue, and 40 minutes on development. And I would say lay out maybe 5 points of development. Maybe 2 are things that they need to work on. Maybe one's an interpersonal vulnerability, maybe another one or 2 are skill gaps. And then make sure 2 or 3 of them are areas that they're strong that you want to amplify, that you want to give them new experience. So it's truly a development plan. It's not just a list of things they got to get better at. Some of these things are things they're good at that you want to give them more exposure to, and some of these areas are vulnerabilities they have to work on, and some of them are skill gaps that you want to build a bridge towards. 40 minutes there, 20 minutes on the how it went back, in the last quarter. Right. So if you're spending 40 minutes on rearview mirror, I wonder if you're giving a steady stream of feedback, because that probably shouldn't take 40 minutes.
That makes sense. I bet a lot of people are not terribly good at giving feedback. I bet that's a challenge for managers.
I think it's a lot easier to give feedback if you give it on an ongoing basis, because the person you're giving feedback to realizes that you don't only come in behind, and offer feedback when things are negative. You do it all the time.
Makes sense. At Kelley, we believe in excelling as a professional and human being, approaching life with our talents and our tenacity and our humility. Pritzker gives back to the community, and your family has been very supportive of the Kelley School of Business and Indiana University, and you yourself give in multiple ways. Why is giving back important to you, especially to your students and with research and books like this?
Well, one of my favorite books is The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which was an old ancient Chinese book of 2,000 years ago, and it's so oriented around service. And if you read, whether it's reading the Tao Te Ching to think about humility and service, or if you read books by Marty Seligman on authentic happiness, or Sonia Lubernowski, The How of Happiness, or Jonathan Haidt, The Happiness Hypothesis, all these books are by researchers who study what makes people happy. What makes people happy is being of service to other people. So not only is it the right thing to do to help people who are in need, it makes you feel good. And so I think a service mindset is a winner, and it's a win in so many ways. I'm so much happier as a teacher, and I've been teaching 7 years now, than I was as an executive. It just makes me happier because I feel like I'm actually maybe changing the course of a student's life a little bit every once in a while.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure good managers can have that same sense of happiness by helping employees, by helping people who report to them develop their skills.
If you have an employee, you'll have somebody come up to you and say, when you that year I was having trouble and you helped me, really changed my career trajectory, and you're doing it right.
That makes sense. We have a question from some of our observers. Ben?
Yes, back on the topic of observing derailment in an organization. The question is, how can one observe if their boss has derailed? What strategies can a person employ to not also be seen as having the wrong stuff simply because their boss has derailed?
So this is death by association. A lot of questions I get around this material is bad boss questions. And what I say is two things. One is make sure you have good connections and relationships broadly beyond your boss. So some of your boss's peers that you interact with, because they can pull you out from under the boss and offer you a job. And even your boss's boss, you want to make sure he or she knows what you're up to and they realize that you're effective. So the first thing is you want to broaden your support base and not just bet on this one person who may be derailing. Secondly, how can you help your boss perform well? How can you be of service to your boss so that they don't derail? What can you take off his or her plate to make them more effective? How can you help them? And that's an important thing. Instead of kind of standing by and watching them derail, maybe you can jump in, take some things off their plate that you're good at, and help them do their job better. But I think in this particular question, you want to make sure you have a broad base of support so you can find safe haven if you have to.
Yeah, I like that advice, though. If you can be of help to a boss who's derailing, then it's a win-win.
Yeah.
You win by that association. We have another question, Ben?
We do. This person says, thank you, Mr. Cass, for sharing your life stories. I admire you and a lot of other people who have the willpower to fight back, to try to find solutions to fix weaknesses. I have a question and would like to hear your advice. Having the reflection of ourselves is just the beginning of change. Besides mindfulness, what are other correction steps to stop what we have been doing wrong in the career? The overcoming weakness mechanism. How to remediate the mindset weakness without compromising uniqueness. Like stubborn is wrong, but persisting may be good.
There are two questions at least I heard here. One is that the flip side of your weakness is often a strength. And this is always interesting. My mischievousness was bad managing up. It could be dangerous, but people liked working with me because I was fun. So I could create energy in a room, but sometimes I was inappropriate with my boss. So there's always a flip side. So I think this is a good question. The flip side of that weakness is a strength, and you want to make sure you mitigate the effects of the weakness while making sure that natural strength you have shines. So for me, even though I had to learn to be more self-monitor and tone it down, I didn't want to leave my personality at the door when I went to work, and I wanted to remain fun-loving like I am. So I think that's a really good question. What was the first part of the question? It was actually a different question.
Sorry, let me go off mute here. The first part of the question is, having the reflection of ourselves is just the beginning of change. Besides mindfulness, what are the other correction steps to stop what we've been doing
So you
wrong?
want to create a system, I believe. I've looked a lot into systems. If you're going to create meaningful change, you have to put steps into place and create a system that works. So I knew that I had a tendency to speak my mind without self-monitoring, especially in certain situations. So what systems can you create that will help you? Sure, meditating has helped me, but a series of steps I put into place, knowing the meetings that are going to be damaging or dangerous, and making sure I go into these meetings with my eyes wide open. But I'm a big believer in creating kind of system solutions. So for example, I have near my belts, where I put my belts away and I have to see it every day, I have a spreadsheet that says 7-5-3-1. 7 days a week, I want to read something that's philosophical, social psychology, or spiritual to keep that learning mindset I talked about, that Carol Dweck talks about. That's 7. 7 days a week for half an hour at least. 5 is meditate 20 minutes for 5 days a week. 3 is get my pulse rate above 140 for at least a half an hour and then stretch 3 days a week. And 1 is have a meaningful conversation about life with another person to stay connected at a human level with people at least once a week. So I have this 7-5-3-1. Every day I check in with it. I have a pen, it hangs from a cord, and I check it or I don't check it because I didn't do it. So that systematic approach to every day I put my belt away, every day I see this, is there an integrity gap between my values and my behavior, or do I have a system in place to help me move along the right path? So that sort of discipline, I think, helps me to continue to make progress against some of my own areas of vulnerability.
I like that. And oftentimes you hear about people who have goals, and simply writing the goals down, rereading those goals on a regular basis, and asking yourself, what did I do to move myself closer to those goals today?
Yeah.
And how did I make progress on this? So it is about putting things in front of you, observing it, and being systematic about approaching it. I think that's really great advice.
I usually say constant, steady pressure, constant, steady pressure. You're going to fall off the wagon, you're going to get back on and try it again tomorrow. You're going to eat the cake that you shouldn't have had, but you're going to get up tomorrow and you're going to try to do better the next day.
Perfect, perfect. Ben, we have another question?
We do. Thank you very much for this informative session. I recognize a point in my career where I have derailed by overcommitting on a major project. If you have personally derailed, at what point do you decide whether it's the right time to pivot to a different role or function in your current company or to switch companies?
Great question. I start with motives. What are you in a role that gives you energy? Because if the answer is, I get energy from this role, then I think you try to figure out how to make it work. You know, you try to talk to your boss about maybe moving on to a different initiative. But if you are not getting energy from the work, I've studied motives quite a bit. There's a guy named David Mcclellan from Harvard who did a lot of work around motives. And he says that we're motivated by achievement, you know, wanting to keep score, self-improvement. We're motivated by affiliation, relational closeness with others. We're motivated by power, status, and exerting influence on others. And then Dan Pink, the author of Drive, would say we're also motivated by purpose, wanting to do something that aligns with our mission, and autonomy, wanting discretion over our work. If you understand what motivates you, you can put yourself in the right work context. But if you're working in an area that you don't have energy, get out. Go someplace and work in some field, industry, stage of company, functional area, whatever it is, go someplace that gives you energy. When is it time to leave? One, it's time to leave when you realize you don't have energy for something. If you can't get your energy up, you're probably in the wrong role. Sometimes it's time to leave if you're blocked by a boss and you have enough reputational damage or you're viewed in a certain way and you don't think you can change that. It may be time to leave. The third time, I think the third area to know it's time to leave is when your learning curve is way down. If you're in your mid-30s and you're learning, you know, I say a learn to leverage ratio. If your learn to leverage ratio is 70% learn, 30% leverage, great. If you're at 70% leverage and 30% learn, and you're only in your 30s, you may want to go someplace to get your learning curve back up. So I think one of the best reasons to leave, other than your motive, you don't have energy for this job, is if you realize that you're practicing your craft, but you're not learning enough that's new. Then I think it's time to try to get rotated on a new assignment inside the company where you can get your learning curve back up. Or if that's not available, it may be time to find something else.
I think that's great advice, and particularly good advice for women, because we sometimes find that women won't move into that next position if they think the learning curve is too steep. And you're suggesting that having an opportunity that has a steep learning curve is what will keep you motivated.
Yeah.
What will keep you engaged in the work. So,
well, you told me something interesting, Idie. You said to me, so many women think they have to have, say, all 8 aspects of the job down cold before they can raise their hand and ask for the promotion, and where men might think if they have 4 or 5, that's sufficient. I found the same thing out in talking to women executives. They felt that same way. You know, I would say if you have 4 or 5 of the core things down and there's 3 things that you don't understand but they're not absolutely essential things, raise your hand and ask for that job.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So we've talked a lot about negatives in career, and what are some of the positive things? The right stuff. Your book is both about the right and wrong stuff, so I want to hear about some of the right stuff, as you say, that people can do to keep their careers on track and moving positively.
So this was the besides that stat around if you aren't self-aware, you derail six times more, the one you mentioned. This was the other statistic that really affected me, got me very interested. High potential high performers are not good at everything. If your company has, say, 10 competencies, analytical thinking, thinking outside the box, bringing others with you, whatever. If you have 10 competencies, people with the right stuff don't have 7 that they're good at. There are 3 I found out of 10 or 11. Only 3 really, really are important that constitute having the right stuff. And here are the 3. And this is by looking at the performance of people that are in the 90th percentile of effectiveness in their company and comparing them to people that are in the bottom quartile. What competency profiles do those people in the 90th percentile have? 3 things they shared. 1, not surprisingly, they're learners. They are always seeking new knowledge. They take their career in their own hand. They raise their hand and be asked to put on new assignments. They're always seeking knowledge. They are learners. Second, they're good at bringing others along with them. They're open-minded. They listen well. St. Francis of Assisi, seek to understand before being understood. They listen well, and they enlist others' support because they are compassionate and empathetic, and they're good listeners. That's the second thing. And the third thing is they have drive for results. They are good at completion. They don't stop until they're done with something. It might be Friday at 10 p.m. If they said they were going to turn it in Friday, they're there at 10 p.m. finishing up that spreadsheet before they hit send. So drive for results, good at enlistment, and lifelong, and see they're in a state of beta. They're always wanting to learn and develop. What's great about that information is, I thought before this book, there's this long list of things you have to be really good at to be considered, a high potential high performer. High potential high performers stink at a bunch of stuff, but they're good at the 3 things that really matter: getting support from others, drive for results, and constantly learning.
I like this idea, though. There are 3 positives you can focus on, and then you need to be aware of those things that could potentially derail and work on those. It's that balancing act. It's that yin and yang of that you have to balance it, really, to be effective. Well, we have one final question, and this is a reflective question for you. I'm curious, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you graduated from business school? So you've got this wonderful career. You've learned a lot in the last few years. What do you wish you had known way back then when you graduated from your MBA program?
I shouldn't have sold Amazon so early. I had stock. It's going to sound weird. This is a strange one, actually. But what I wish I would have known in the 90s, early 90s, when I graduated from business school is don't worry about what other people think of you, because they're not thinking of you. They're worried about their own lives. They're worried about their mortgage, or they're worried about their sick kid, or they're worried about their own career. So I don't mean that to sound jaded, but don't worry about what other people think of you, because they're the protagonist in their own play just as you're the protagonist in your play. That frees you up, that mindset frees you up to do what you should do based on what you're motivated by. So if you don't want to take the job at Deloitte, but it sounds good, don't take the job at Deloitte just because it sounds good. If you want to take the job at Deloitte because it excites you, take it. But do what gives you energy and do what your values dictate. Don't worry about how you're being viewed by others, because they're not viewing you as much as you think they are. I wish I would have known that, and I would have made the move into doing entrepreneurial ventures much earlier than I did. But I was worried about, is this how am I being perceived if I go to a startup versus this track I was on? And I wish I would have worried less about what people thought of me, because I would have made different career choices based on where I got the most energy. I finally sort of figured it out that people don't care what I do. The only people that care are really close to me, and actually they don't even care. They just want me to be happy.
Right. So find where your passions are and pursue them. And
That's
don't worry
right.
about others' impressions, but do
That's
what,
right,
what
'cause
excites
they
you.
aren't evaluating, they aren't judging you to the extent you think they are.
That's great advice. Well, Carter, I want to thank you for your time and insight. We are grateful to have had you come to our Kelley studio this evening and talk to a combination of people. We have some of our current Kelley Direct students here. We have some of our Business of Medicine students. We have alums from all of our programs, and we're so very grateful for you coming. And thank you all for joining the Kelley School of Business for our discussion with Carter Cass. Shortly following this webinar, all registrants will receive a recording of this evening's discussion. And a special thank you to our Kelley students and alums joining us this evening, and the staff who's been with us here tonight. We're continuing our tradition of going from moment to momentum. I'm Dean Idie Kesner, and from all of us at the Kelley School of Business, good night and thank you.